Coming, and thank you, Anne, for that lovely introduction. So I will go ahead and start. This is part of my fifth chapter of my book. In the hallway outside a large auditorium in the summer of 1968, famed Egyptian and literary critic Yusuf as-Sibai was on the lookout. An Arabic poetry night was being held as part of the 7th International Festival of Youth and Students in Sofia, Bulgaria, and Sibai was eager to meet Mahmud Darwish, whose powerful verses about Palestine, the Arab nation, and the struggles of people all over the world had been featured prominently in some of the leading Arabic journals during the previous months. The festival also provided the first opportunity for Palestinian members of the Israeli Communist Rakah delegation. Rakah is the name of the Israeli Communist Party at the time. And that included Darwish and his fellow poet activist Samih al-Qasim. The festival was the first opportunity for them to travel abroad and meet face-to-face with some of the roughly 500 Arab and Palestinians attending the festival. When Sibai was finally introduced to the slim, clean-shaven 26-year-old Darwish, and that's a picture of him at Sofia, the Egyptian critic exclaimed in surprise, "You're Mahmud Darwish? I thought you were fat and had a mustache." But not everyone was eager to meet the famed poets of resistance. In keeping with the Arab League Boycott of Israel, officially in place since 1948 and reaffirmed in the aftermath of the 1967 June War, leaders of the official Syrian Ba'athist Party forbade its members from having any contact in Sofia with anyone deemed to be a Zionist. A few Syrian delegates even distributed leaflets alleging that the two men at Sofia claiming to be Darwish and Qasim were really Mossad agents, sent to impersonate the poets, while the real poets were locked away in an Israeli prison. For Qasim, such accusations reeked of nothing more than defamation and betrayal. These two episodes highlight the mystique that Palestinian citizens of Israel, especially the resistance poets, came to have in segments of the Arab political imaginary after the 1967 war, as well as the ways in which their growing prominence complicated and in times enlightened Arab views of their conflict with Israel and the role of the Palestinians in it. On the one hand, many Palestinians and Arabs welcomed the resistance poets. This was a term coined by Palestinian novelist and literary critic Ghassan Kanafani. They welcomed the resistance poets as a sign of hope amid the despair of the June defeat. After all, the resistance poets demonstrated that Palestinian Arab nationalist identity could withstand 2 decades of harsh Israeli military rule and the attempted erasure of their identity. On the other hand, some Arabs remained skeptical that the Palestinians in Israel, even the nationalist poets among them, could really be considered symbols of resistance. After all, they had accepted the citizenship and passports of the sworn enemy of the Arabs, and they refused to join the Fidaiyin or take up arms against the Israeli state. For these skeptics, such actions seemed to confirm the official Israeli portrayal of the Arab Israelis as a content minority in the Jewish state. And if that wasn't indeed the case, the skeptics concluded, then of course they should be considered targets in the boycott against Israel. So this paper examines the contours and consequences of these debates through a close reading of the 7th International Festival of Youth and Students, also known as the World Youth Festival. The 9th such festival was held in Bulgaria, in Sofia, Bulgaria, from July 26 to August 6, 1968. I argue that this festival marked a turning point in the development of an Arab political vocabulary that began to include more fully the Palestinian citizens of Israel. This was due in large part to the efforts of Palestinian festival participants from the Shatat, or from exile, especially those residing in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, who played a key role in helping to demystify the Palestinian citizens of Israel to a wider audience. Through a discursive analysis of press reports, memoirs, literary works, and interviews with the participants, I show how these Palestinians tried to mitigate against the collateral damage done to the reputations of the Palestinians within Israel by emphasizing the need to recognize the difference between one's national identity and one's identity card, especially in colonial contexts. They did so through personal discussions with other Arab delegates and through impassioned essays published in some of the leading newspapers and journals of the time. These actions, coupled with ongoing efforts by the Palestinian citizens of Israel themselves to reach out to their fellow Arabs, ushered in a new vocabulary of political solidarity that began to include more fully this previously excluded group of Palestinians. So today what I'd like to do first is discuss how these Palestinians in Israel came to be seen as an enigma in the Arab world, despite early efforts by Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line to reach out to one another. And then I'll talk about how the June 67 war and the events of Global 68 altered the circumstances under which the festival was held, and the ways in which the festival became an opportunity to challenge earlier paradigms and provide an opportunity for new political formations to emerge. And finally, I'll offer what I think are some lessons that we might be able to learn from this episode and its aftermath, both historiographically and in terms of practical applications. In the interest of time, I'll allude only briefly to my theoretical framework in which I seek to extend the concept of relational history laid out by historian Zachary Lockman, where he argued that Jewish and Arab communities in Mandate Palestine were, quote, were to a significant extent constituted and shaped within the complex matrix of political, social, and cultural interactions. And I also take up the challenge laid out by anthropologists Rebecca Stein and Ted Swedenborg to understand how the dynamics of intranational relationality within the nation, as well as transnational relationality, affect the development of societies. So how communities develop in relationship to one another and how these relationships themselves impact the development of various communities. So a bit of historical background. The making of the Palestinian minority in Israel was a direct, if unintended, consequence of the tumultuous events of 1948, in which the well-organized military forces of a relatively small Jewish population of about 650,000 in British Mandatory Palestine defeated the forces of an Arab population more than twice that size, and subsequently defeated the armies of several Arab states. As a result, the Palestinian Arab community was dramatically altered from a community that constituted over 2/3 of the population of Palestine and owned nearly 90% of the land, to one that was dispersed and dispossessed. Over half of the nearly 1.4 million Palestinian Arabs, including nearly all those who had held national leadership positions, were driven or fled from their homes, primarily to the surrounding countries, while the approximately 150,000 Palestinians who remained within the 1949 armistice line, what we now call the Green Line, became a small minority within the new state of Israel. Though most of them were granted Israeli citizenship by 1953, their identity cards clearly marked them as Arab, and they faced various forms of discrimination, including placement under tight control through a military government, subjection to continued land confiscations, and punishment for political activities deemed a security threat. They also had little contact with Palestinians and Arabs outside the armistice line. As Palestinian Israeli novelist and literary critic Anton Shammas wrote, quote, "The state of Israel put us in isolation." This included isolation within Israel, where the military government enforced a host of restrictions on the Palestinian minority through a complex bureaucratic regime of permits and passes that determined where they could live, where they could work, and where they could travel. It also included isolation from the Arab world, as Israel banned its citizens from traveling to Arab countries and limited the importation of Arabic media into the country, claiming that any such contacts could potentially lead to the incitement of the Palestinian minority. This isolation was reinforced by the Arab League boycott of all Israeli institutions, goods, and citizens, which also extended to the Palestinian citizens. So in this climate of repression and fragmentation, cultural productions, especially poetry and prose works, were key in helping Palestinian citizens of Israel subvert these attempts to detach them from one another and from the broader region. Palestinian cultural producers surreptitiously brought in hard-to-get newspapers, literary journals, and poetry collections from abroad, whether through contacts in Europe or with the help of Jewish Israeli friends and colleagues who had more latitude in what they could access. Moreover, given the difficulty of gathering for large-scale oppositional political actions, Palestinians turned to the local Arabic newspapers and journals to express their political views, most notably through poetry, literary reviews, and political essays. Sharing in the production and consumption of this media connected Palestinians in disparate parts of the country to one another and proved crucial in helping Palestinian citizens of Israel undermine efforts to detach them from the broader region. And this is something that I explore more fully in my book. So despite their political and geographic isolation, Palestinians in Israel were deeply invested in the developments affecting Palestinians across the 1949 armistice line, Palestinians in exile, as well as developments in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and beyond. They paid close attention to questions of nationalism in both its pan-Arab or Qawmi and territorial or Watani forms, as well as to questions regarding the role of cultural production in promoting political change at the national, regional, and global levels. As with other Palestinians and Arabs, many supported Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser in the late 1950s and early 60s. They listened intently to the Egyptian radio broadcast that carried Nasser's speeches, as well as news reports that emphasized Afro-Asian solidarity. So throughout this period, Palestinians in Israel turned to various means in order to express their feelings of solidarity with Palestinians, Arabs, and other peoples around the world. But despite this deep engagement, prior to 1967, Palestinians in Israel were largely ignored in the Arab world. At first, many Arabs believed the Israeli propaganda that described them as a content minority in the Jewish state, and therefore regarded Palestinians who accepted Israeli citizenship as turncoats. In this climate, Palestinians in exile were among the first to draw international attention to the Israeli mistreatment of its Palestinian citizens. Two reports issued in 1955 and 56 and penned by Palestinian diplomats sought to raise awareness about the plight of Palestinians in Israel. Though these reports had a bit of a propagandistic tone to them, they were also important in conveying this message. By the early 1960s, a few Palestinians in exile began to see the Palestinians in Israel as more than just victims to be pitied. In a 1961 lecture by Palestinian historian Ahmed Sidqi Dajani on the condition of the Palestinians in Israel, and this was a lecture he gave at the Cultural Center in Tripoli, Libya, where he lived, Dajani stressed that, far from being passive victims, Palestinians in Israel displayed strong national consciousness and engaged in acts of resistance. Dajani concluded, quote, "There is no doubt that these brothers play a large role in our struggle against the usurping enemy. Until the day comes that we reunite with our beloved land, we send them greetings of love and admiration." Dajani's appeal to locate the Palestinian citizens of Israel within the broader Palestinian revolutionary imaginary was an attempt to resituate this group and integrate them more thoroughly into the Palestinian national narrative, from which they had largely been excluded. While novel, this was still an uncommon framing at this time. During the 1960s, Palestinians in Israel also increasingly sought to reach out to the outside world. In particular, the attempts by the Ard movement, the land movement, to establish connections with the Arab world and the international community captured the imaginations not only of Palestinian activists in the surrounding countries, but also of other Arab nationalists who gradually paid more attention to these developments. In 1964, the Ard movement issued a memorandum to the Arab League, and this is Sabri Jarias, he's one of the co-founders of the Ard movement, and I'll talk more about him in a minute. In 1964, the Ard movement issued a memorandum and sent it to the Arab League, the United Nations, and other world bodies, demanding that international action be taken to ameliorate their mistreatment at the hands of the Israeli government. And they enumerated what they were, and it's a long list that I won't go into right now. Land confiscation, discrimination at various levels. When the Israeli High Court banned the group in 1965, deeming it a security threat, Palestinian Israeli attorney and Ard co-founder Sabri Jarias took to the pen. The following year, in 1966, he published his groundbreaking study, The Arabs in Israel. Jarias' study was originally published in Hebrew and intended for an Israeli audience. He methodically laid out the legal regime that Israel imposed on its Palestinian citizens in order to confiscate their lands and to pacify them politically. Palestinians in Beirut, who were affiliated with the newly established Institute for Palestine Studies, translated Jarias' book into Arabic and English to ensure wider distribution and greater awareness of their plight. With attention focused on the political circumstances of the Palestinians in Israel, their cultural resistance to Israeli hegemony was largely overlooked. This changed with the publication of Kanafani's 1966 groundbreaking study, Resistance Literature in Occupied Palestine, where Kanafani introduced the Palestinian poets, including Darwish, al-Qasim, and others, to a wider Arab audience, and argued that, far from the quiescent portrayal of them in Israeli propaganda, they were, in fact, actively resisting Israeli policies and the Zionist ideology that underpinned them. At first, Kanafani's study received modest attention, but the 1967 Six-Day War changed all that. Israel's invasion and occupation of the remainder of historic Palestine, along with the occupation of the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, caused international outrage, largely because it violated two of the most fundamental tenets of the international world order after World War II. First, that international boundaries are to be respected, and second, that territory shall not be acquired by force, regardless of any claims of self-defense. In response to Israel's actions, the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Yugoslavia all cut off diplomatic ties with Israel on June 10th, while countries that maintained diplomatic relations nonetheless roundly opposed its actions, a stance enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242. Having underestimated Israel's military strength at the eve of the war, Arab intellectuals were initially in a state of shock at the war's quick and decisive outcome. Once they started to emerge from their shock, many called for broader self-introspection and began to search for answers that could help them understand why such a sudden and massive and extensive defeat had occurred. In addition, they sought out new heroic models that could replace the one that was discredited of Nassar-led Arab nationalism. For many, the rise of the Palestinian armed resistance, embodied by the Fidaiyin, proved to be a new source of inspiration for which they had hoped. Within this context of reassessment, leftist and nationalist Arab intellectuals and activists turned once again to Kanafani and to his call to look at the Palestinians in Israel, especially the resistance poets, as a model of cultural resistance. As a result, over the course of 1968 and 69, widely circulating Arabic journals such as the Beirut-based monthly Al-Adab and the Cairo-based monthly Al-Adib devoted entire issues to the lives and works of these writers. But not all Arabs shared in this hopeful and celebratory mood. Many continued to denounce the Palestinians in Israel for choosing to remain under Zionist rule, for accepting Israeli citizenship and passports, and for refusing to initiate a mass insurrection in order to help the guerrilla fighters overthrow the regime. In doing so, the logic went the Palestinians in Israel were in fact complicit in Israel's misdeeds. More broadly speaking, the year 1968 saw global upheaval as marginalized groups around the world, particularly students and workers, demanded more rights. In France, Mexico, Brazil, Spain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, West Berlin, Rome, London, Paris, Italy, as well as in the United States, widespread opposition to the American escalation of the Vietnam War, growing impatience with the lingering vestiges of colonialism, coupled with domestic economic concerns and political grievances, and led these marginalized groups to take to the streets. They not only called for improvements in their own lives, but also called for fundamental changes to the world order, learning from and building on lessons learned across national and ideological boundaries. It was in this tumultuous climate that the roughly 20,000 delegates from around the world, primarily students and activists, began making their way to Sofia. So we'll turn to the conference now.
You don't have a picture of Woodstock?
That would be too easy. And actually, now that you get me started on this, in America, we tend to associate 1968 primarily with political and cultural revolution, Woodstock, Chicago, those sorts of things. And one of the things that I'm looking at in my book, and hopefully what will come through a little bit today as well, is that these were really part of a much larger movement, a much more global movement, one that was concerned primarily actually with issues of international order, economic rights, political rights, etc. And I think that a lot of this is part of a broader problem that we'll talk about in the conclusion a bit, but we tend to be very atomized in how we look at developments around the world. And so the American protests of '68 are tended to be examined in the American context. And I'm trying to examine them in a broader framework. So in that spirit, we'll talk about the International Festival of Youth and Students. This was a quadrennial cultural festival that had been launched by the Komsomol, the youth wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, back in 1945. Its aim was to celebrate and promote friendship and freedom among Soviet bloc countries and to draw leftist activists from around the world more firmly into the Soviet orbit. These events were lively, These festivals were lively events consisting of a massive opening ceremony, sports competitions, folklore performances, art and cultural displays, and some political events. The Moscow-based International Preparatory Committee, or IPC, determined how many seats would be allocated to each delegation, and planning committees in each of the invited countries could choose who would be included as part of their respective delegation. As chief sponsor, the Soviet Union covered all of the delegates' expenses, including travel and accommodation. For many attendees, this was their first trip abroad. Prior to this 9th festival in 1968, so there were 8 prior, and those 8 prior, the Arab-Israeli conflict didn't factor much into those festivals. The IPC had invited Israel to participate starting in 1949, and throughout the 1950s, the IPC had extended invitations to Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, the FLN wing of Algeria. Generally, Israeli and Arab delegations had avoided one another, though reports from earlier festivals do indicate some positive interactions between Arab and Jewish members of the Israeli delegation and their Arab counterparts. So unlike these previous festivals, which had kept political events to a minimum, politics played a major role in the festival at Sofia. Since the Soviet Union and Bulgaria, the host country, had both cut diplomatic ties from the Israeli government, the IPC disinvited any Israeli delegate belonging to a political party that had supported the '67 war. And that would be the ruling party of Maha and the leftist, Labor actually by this time, and then the leftist Zionist party Mapam, both of whom had been the majority of the delegates coming. The Communist Party was always sort of junior partner to this umbrella organization, or umbrella delegation, I should say. So with the official party Labor and with Mapam both disinvited, that left only the communist Rakah party, which had opposed the war from the beginning and had continued to call for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories as the only delegation from Israel that was invited. Then there was the question of Palestinian representation. Until 1968, Palestinians had always been subsumed under other Arab delegations, but with the rise of the PLO and their defiant stance at Karama the previous March of '68, the Arab committees petitioned the IPC to allow an independent Palestinian delegation to attend. But pressure from Romania, Czechoslovakia, and others led the IPC to ultimately reject that proposal. They eventually reached a compromise whereby a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation would be allowed to attend. In response, the Algerian and Syrian committees initially said they would boycott the Sofia festival, both over the lack of an independent Palestinian delegation and over the decision to include any Israeli representative. But interestingly, it was Palestinian student political and military groups from the Shatat, from the exile, who were a part of these planning committee discussions, who opposed this move of boycott. They argued that it was significant that for the very first time the Palestinian flag would be waving at an international festival at all. And rather than use the festival as an opportunity for grandstanding, the Palestinians argued, it should be used, quote, as a pulpit to inform in a practical way the youth of the world about this issue, unquote. These arguments ultimately persuaded the Syrian committee, leaving only Algeria to boycott the festival that year. The next question that Arab planning committees had to decide was the extent to which they could or should embrace members of the Israeli delegation. Once again, Palestinians sought to persuade their fellow Arab delegates that there was no need to boycott other Arab delegates just because they held Israeli passports, and in fact, no need to boycott the Arab delegation at all. But in Damascus, Palestinian Ba'athist delegate and planning committee member Faisal Harani raised this issue with his colleagues ahead of the festival. He had been accessing the Rakah newspaper Al-Ittihad, and he was familiar with the party's oppositional stance. Seeking to avoid what he called a damaging episode, he pleaded with the Syrian Ba'athist leaders to remove the ban on dealing with anyone who had anything to do with Israel. And then, as I said at the beginning, his pleas went unheeded. Meanwhile, in Amman, some members of the Jordanian delegation criticized the poets for being communists and for recognizing Israel. But the Palestinian members who were in attendance at these planning committees, who understood well what it meant to possess the passport of one country while longing for independence in another, argued that just as Palestinians in Jordan recognized Jordanian rule over them, yet still identified as Palestinians, so too was the case for the Palestinians in Israel. As one delegate told me, very wisely, They are Palestinians, whether they are there or here. This theme, the need to distinguish between one's national identity and one's identity card, was central in the discussions of how to proceed. And it was, I think, as I said, a turning point in the recognition of how to recognize or how to view the Palestinian citizens of Israel. As for the Palestinian Rakah delegates, they were filled with joy. As Qasim recalled, it was the first trip abroad for him and for many of his colleagues, and they were especially excited because, as Qasim put it, quote, "We were going to meet up with the brothers and comrades from the Arab people after a compulsory estrangement that has lasted 20 years, in which we did not meet a single Arab from our larger nation." And they soon had a chance. So these are a couple of pictures, not directly from my talk, but they were the only pictures I could find of Palestinian delegates from the 1968 festival. These are Jamil Shammout and Taysir Qubha. And they're at the opening procession. You can see the people lining the streets as people are marching down the streets of Bulgaria, the streets of Sofia, to go to the main stadium where the opening procession is taking place. And then you can see there, Qubha, or Shammout rather, is pinning a Palestinian flag, autographing a delegate's shirt at the Sofia festival. And for those of you who've watched the opening ceremony of the Olympics, this definitely resonated with me, the sort of celebratory feel, the idea of walking to the stadium. They were wearing uniforms. They didn't have uniforms because they were wearing their hattas. But the other countries all would have uniforms that they would wear and walk behind the flag in the opening procession. So the World Youth Festival had a celebratory Olympic-style feel to it. Upon arriving at Sofia's airports and main train stations, delegates were met by scores of Bulgarian children, greeting them with flowers. During the day of the opening ceremony, as delegates walked several kilometers along the route to Lipski Stadium, people lined the streets and threw flowers and cheered, while planes flew in formation above. Wearing keffiyehs around their necks, the roughly 50 Palestinian delegates and their Bulgarian hosts chanted in unison, "Mir, mir, druzhba, druzhba," friendship, friendship, freedom, freedom. As delegates from Egypt and the other Arab countries passed along the streets, they and the Sofia residents along the sides of the road chanted, "Viva Egypt, Viva Jordan, Viva Arabs." In this pro-Arab climate, the 74 Jewish and Arab members of the Israeli Rakah delegation were nonetheless received warmly. In contrast to the joyous disposition of many of the delegates, the Rakah delegates came in a somber mood. They walked in the procession without any musical instruments or songs, merely holding up two large banners, each with a simple message emblazoned in Hebrew and in English, "Arab land for Arabs," and "With the Arab people against the Israeli occupation." As they arrived at the stadium, delegates from around the world stood up and cheered as they marched by. The delegations from Jordan, which included a large number of Palestinians, as well as that of South Yemen, which was dominated by communists, were particularly warm. But the official Syrian delegation, gotta love those Ba'athists, they had boycotted this opening procession. They had gone straight to the stadium. And when the Rakah delegation walked by, they denounced them as assassins and chanted very loudly, "Falastin Arabiya," Arab Palestine. This was recognized as an exception to an otherwise warm reception. But there was also a need to be cautious. So al-Qasim and Darwish in particular were cautious. They had been aware of episodes of hostility towards the Palestinian Israeli delegates at previous World Youth Festivals by some Arabs who had in particular been incensed at seeing Palestinians marching behind an Israeli flag at the opening ceremony. Seeking to avoid such a scene, Darwish and Qasim decided ahead of time to walk at some distance behind the rest of the delegation during the opening procession, so they would not be seen or pictured walking directly behind the Israeli flag. They also decided to drape their blazers over their forearms in order to hide the party emblem emblazoned on their jackets, which Qasim worried might, quote, inflame some of the Arab delegates, unquote. Given this political atmosphere, it is no surprise that the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict featured prominently in the programming at Sofia. Rakah delegates sought to use their insider position as Israeli citizens to position themselves as a bridge linking the Arab message to an international audience. Rakah members distributed booklets called The Other Israelis that featured pictures and descriptions of Israeli aggression against Arab and Arab lands. At a plenary session devoted to the discussion of the political crisis in the Middle East, Rakah delegation leader George Toubi roundly criticized Israel's actions in the 1967 war as serving imperialist aims. But Tubi also chastised the Arabs for employing overheated rhetoric, warning, quote, the irresponsible and chauvinistic propaganda in several Arab quarters, which does not distinguish between the people in Israel and the regressive government that is allied with imperialism, provided a pretext for the war that has helped the Ashkal Dayan Begin government to deceive large portions of world public opinion with regard to the aggressive nature of this war. This war was not defensive, as the Israeli government claims, but rather to defend the imperialist interests in the Middle East. Tubi hoped that he could persuade Arab delegates to moderate their rhetoric in order not to provide Israel with excuses to continue their aggression, while claiming a posture of self-defense. This balancing act symbolized the position that Tubi and other Palestinian Rakah delegates saw themselves in. Through their intimate knowledge of Israeli politics and society, they could help Arabs be more strategic in their confrontation with Israel, while also contributing to peace in the region. In addition to political forums, there were cultural events were a major part of the festival as well. Rakah delegates showcased Arab and Hebrew folkloric dances and sang songs about peace and brotherhood. Members of the Palestinian delegation likewise performed the debke and set up display boards authored by the PLO Arts and Cultural History Division, showing the history of the Palestinian conflict, as well as displays by Palestinian artists' work, including those of famed Palestinian artist Ibrahim Shamot. In addition, various delegations organized poetry nights featuring well-known poets. The Iraqi delegation organized a poetry night featuring famed Iraqi poet Muhammad Mahdi al-Jawahiri, while Arab students studying in Sofia arranged for a Palestinian poetry night featuring Darwish and al-Qasim. At this latter event, attendees packed the large room and flowed out into the hallway. Audience members were so excited to hear the resistance poets that they kept calling for more poems to be recited, extending the poetry night far past its allotted 2 hours. So for the most part, Darwish and al-Qasim received a warm reception from the other Arab delegates, enthusiastic in fact. And so great was the interest in meeting the resistance poets that some of the attendees from Syria defied the orders of their superiors, a risky thing to do under the Ba'athist regime, to be sure. Syrian students studying abroad met with the poets secretly at one student's home, where they spoke about the Palestinian people and their suffering, while other members of the official Syrian delegation also defied their party leaders and met with the poets surreptitiously. In addition, the poets themselves were eager to meet other Arabs. When Qasim heard that Iraqi poet Muhammad Mahdi al-Jawahiri was in town, he insisted on meeting him. Together with Darwish and their roommate, attorney Muhammad Mighari, they went to Jawahiri's hotel room one morning during the festival for a secret meeting. The elderly poet was surprised at their insistence on wanting to meet him, but nonetheless welcomed them in. He was further taken aback when they insisted on taking this picture with him, even though he was still in his sleeping dishdasha. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, they insisted, and without it, their participation in the festival would be incomplete. Jawahiri graciously posed with the 2 young poets while Mighari took the picture. But the Iraqi poet had one request, that they not publish the picture, lest it raise the suspicions of the feared Iraqi Mukhabarat, the Secret Service. So this was published posthumously, as you might imagine. So turning to the immediate aftermath of the festival, there certainly were political fallouts from these small acts of rebellion that took place in Sofia. Back in Damascus, Faisal Hurani was expelled from the Syrian Ba'ath Party for insubordination after he was seen shaking Darwish's hand. Meanwhile, Darwish and Qasim were brought before a party inquiry, though not expelled, for refusing to walk behind the Israeli flag at the opening ceremony. The Sofia festival also gave attendees food for thought. Arab delegates who had assumed that Palestinian resistance necessarily took the form of armed resistance were surprised by the unimposing stature of Darwish and Qasim. Lebanese writer and critic Mohammed Dakrub said that he had expected to meet giants and was surprised at their youth. Quote, with the innocence of children, they spoke about prison and resistance as they would any other matter. Resistance for them had become an ordinary thing, part of their everyday lives. The young Palestinians from Israel were also deeply affected by their conference, which for the first time made them feel less isolated. Upon returning home, they stressed how moved they were to see so much support for Palestinians and their cause. Attorney Mi'ari said that the displays of support and solidarity, quote, convince you that despite all the forces of evil and aggression and spuriousness in the world, things are all right. But Darwish was not so sure. He had felt the tug of both his Palestinian and Israeli identities during the festival, especially when he stood before the 10-story dormitories that housed the visiting delegates. Each tower accommodated 4 delegations. The Palestinian-Jordanian one was housed with those from Mexico, Panama, and Colombia. No Arab delegation shared a tower with Israel. As Darwish recalled in his memoir, this spatial division epitomized the contradictions in Darwish's life. Quote, what does it mean to stand in Sofia between 2 buildings, one flying the Palestinian flag and the other the Israeli? Are you capable of embodying the Palestinian spirit under the Israeli flag? Or can you be a thing and its opposite at the same time? And beyond all that, who are you? After the festival, Palestinian intellectuals in exile once again took up the cause of defending the Palestinian citizens of Israel to a wider audience. Palestinian historian and PLO Central Committee member Ahmed Sidqi Dajani, whom we met earlier, chastised those Arab delegates at Sofia who had dismissed the Palestinians in Israel just because they held an Israeli passport. Comments he heard from some delegates that the Rakah delegates should not return home, should renounce their passport and join the Fida'in, were especially disappointing to him. Quote, such behavior is simply a reaction that reveals the blatant ignorance of the circumstances of our brothers in their occupied territory and of the heroic struggle over the past 20 years. There is no need to rush to condemn an Arab hero simply because he carries an Israeli passport that has been imposed on him, as long as this Arab believes in and works toward liberating his land. After all, the Italian passport was forced upon Libya for a time, and the French passport was forced upon Algeria for a time. That imposition only increased their determination as they fought while carrying the enemy's passports. So this combination of warm embraces and furtive meetings, I would argue, suggests a complex and contradictory picture in which Palestinian delegates from both sides of the Green Line used the festival as an opportunity to connect with each other and subvert efforts to fragment their national formation. But at the same time, delegates had to navigate the delicate politics of boycotting Israel, while at the same time trying not to further marginalize the very people with whom they wish to express solidarity. Rakah delegates, for their part, also reached out to other Arabs in order to show them that there is more to Israel than what government officials proclaim. So to conclude, I'd like to not fall over. That would be good. And then to offer what I think are a few conceptual and practical lessons that we can derive from the episode I recalled here today. Conceptually, for those who study social formations, whether in historical or contemporary contexts, I think that it's crucial that we look beyond the nation state as a framework for analysis. As we saw, Palestinians in exile played a clear and important role in demystifying the Palestinians of Israel to a broader audience. And we also saw the ways in which Palestinians in Israel actively subverted their own political and geographic isolation. Broadening our lens of analysis beyond the nation state allows us to see interesting and below-the-radar dynamics that would otherwise get overlooked. Having said that, I think it's also important to avoid treating these global developments as a series of discrete events. And here is where Stein and Swedenborg's notion of international and transnational relationality can help. By examining the ways in which different groups and events impact one another and relate to one another, we can gain a better understanding of the multidimensional dynamics that emerge and the new political formations that take hold. Practically, I would submit that this episode challenges us to consider the potential impact of boycotts on efforts to build solidarity. In that regard, one of the important lessons I think here is the importance of listening to those with whom we wish to express solidarity. Sounds kind of basic. But what we saw in 1968 were examples of constructive and destructive forms of boycott. And the difference stemmed largely from the fact that the Ba'athist officials, for example, didn't bother listening to the very people whom they claimed to be supporting. Those who did listen, whether to the verses of the resistance poets or to the appeals of the Palestinians in exile, began to have a more nuanced understanding of Israel, of the conflict, and of the Palestinians who resided in it. Another key lesson is that one sign of a constructive boycott is the emergence of novel political formations that open up new conversations rather than foreclose them. The conversations that began in Sofia continued long after the festival pavilions were taken down, and it marked a turning point in the relationship between Palestinians and Israel and the Arab world. Moving forward, there are, of course, many other ways in which we can think about the applicability or lack thereof of these lessons in current and future organizing. But I'm going to stop right here and talk about them in the Q&A. Thank you.